I want to introduce our speaker at this point. Ramona Trevino is a living testament of the power of prayer and the witness of public faith. Her transformation from someone who fought for abortion to an individual who is now a warrior in the pro-life movement is proof that the struggle is a winnable one. For 3 years, Ramona worked as the manager of a Planned Parenthood abortion referral facility in Sherman, Texas. In the spring of 2011, thanks to the inspiration of a local Christian radio station, the prayers and public witness of a 40 Days for Life campaign, and through God's grace, Ramona reclaimed her walk with Christ and resigned her position at Planned Parenthood, which resulted in the clinic closing. A native of Trenton, Texas, a small town northeast of Dallas, Ramona is married to a godly man and they have 6 children. Please help me welcome Ramona Trevino.
Liveliness. We're here for a celebration of life, right? Yeah. God is good? Yeah. All the time? Yeah. And all the time? Yeah. God is good. Thank you so much to Elkhart County Right for Life for inviting me today. It's always such a huge blessing and honor. I don't know about you, but I feel the Holy Spirit here today. And I was just extremely moved listening to these young ladies' angelic voices, and I just teared up. You know, it's just so moving. I think it doesn't matter how many times I do this, it doesn't matter how or where I go, how big the crowd, how small the crowd. It is a humbling experience for me to be able to share the beautiful story that God wrote in my life. So, you know, I know it's tough this time of year, especially for me. I don't know about you, and well, I'm sure all of you who've been fighting this battle for so long. For me, it's been about a little over 7 years since I began working in the pro-life movement and sharing my story. But when I think about the anniversary of Roe v. Wade that's coming up on January 22nd, it blows me away to think that here we are 46 years later. 46 years later, over 61 million precious lives that have perished. And I think when you really try to wrap your brain around that, it's impossible to think of each and every tiny human life that has perished. I know for me, it's unfathomable. I can't grasp that number. I can't, it's so difficult. Even to think that every year, more than 500,000 babies lives are lost in this country every year. And even that is almost impossible to wrap your brain around. It doesn't even seem possible. So, you know, at the heart of that, at the center of that tragedy, we often focus on the biggest perpetrator and promoter of abortion, who's Planned Parenthood, right? So when we, you know, think of abortion, it's often synonymous with Planned Parenthood. And I feel such great remorse to think that I once worked for the largest abortion provider in our country, a provider who commits over 300,000 abortions each year. So we think about the 600,000 plus abortions that are that occur every year, and then at the center of that, you have Planned Parenthood, who commits more than half of those. And you know, I think of how I was once complicit in that horrific sin that is abortion. I think my story is a story of faith. It's a story of God's love. It's a story of God's mercy. And I think, you know, oftentimes when I share this story with the public, people make assumptions on what they think they're going to hear. Or, you know, there's really not anything that I can ever tell you that many of you don't already know about Planned Parenthood. We know what they're responsible for. We know all of the details, because thankfully God has moved so many hearts, and so many former abortion workers who have come out over the years and found the courage to come out and reveal the truth about who Planned Parenthood is. And that just tells us that God is moving. God is moving in our lives. God is answering our prayers, right? I didn't work at a facility that provided abortions. And I think that part of my story is very important, because it points to this organization on a different level, the one that so many of the American people defend. On one hand, you have people who defend Planned Parenthood, who say they provide, good services to women. You have people who say, well, they don't all provide abortions. Abortion is only a small percentage of what they do, and we know that's a lie. We know that abortion is their mission. That's where they get all of their money. And but I'm here to kind of give you an insight onto that other side of Planned Parenthood, the side of Planned Parenthood that is supported with our tax dollars, and why it's so important that we defund this organization now. We should have defunded them yesterday, right? They need to be defunded. And I want to take you back a little bit because the biggest question that I get asked often is, Ramona, how in the world did you end up at Planned Parenthood, right? Like, how does somebody end up working for an organization like Planned Parenthood? And I think the short answer is lack of education, lack of knowledge. And so I think that's why it's super important that we as pro-lifers are vocal, that we share as much information as we can with our family, our friends, our neighbors. It's something that we need to be talking about. I didn't grow up in a household where abortion was talked about. I grew up in a small rural town about an hour north of Dallas. I still live there and raised my family there. But we're talking a population of less than 700 people, right? And so we're talking very rural, very country, as you can tell from my Texas accent. But abortion wasn't something that was spoken of, and I didn't even know where women went to get abortions. I didn't even know anyone who had ever had an abortion. I was born after Roe v. Wade, and so I was born in a post-Roe v. Wade country and world, and so legalized abortion was all I knew, but it wasn't something that I thought was common. And so when I began working for Planned Parenthood, I had accepted this position because it was an opportunity to be a clinic director, and I thought that I was going to be helping women. I was really deceived into thinking that, well, we don't do abortions at this facility, so my hands will be clean. And I think oftentimes it's easy to lie to yourself and say, well, that's something they do somewhere else. This is a separate affiliate. The abortions take place in the big city, in Dallas. It's not going to affect me. I'm not going to be complicit in anything. And so I really believe that I was helping to prevent abortions. And it's sad to say, and it's almost embarrassing, well, actually it is embarrassing to say that when I accepted my job at Planned Parenthood, I had no idea that Planned Parenthood was the largest abortion provider. And I had no idea that at that time, in 2007, I think the statistic was around 51 or 52 million babies who had been lost to abortion. And so you think about that from 2008 till today, how many more lives have been lost. But I had no idea about that astronomical number of, I honestly believed that, like they say, in all of the talking points, that abortion was rare. That it was legal, that it was safe, and that it was rare. And rarity. I didn't think it happened. I didn't think women could actually choose that. So I began working for Planned Parenthood in 2008 as the clinic director. And initially I went in, okay, we do well woman exams, we do pap smears, we do birth control, we do STD testing. We're providing a service to women, and we're not any different than a gynecologist's office, correct? That was my mentality. That's what I believed I was going in to do. That we were helping women who were underinsured, that we were helping women who needed medical care and access to that affordably. I bought into those lies. And I believed that I had nothing to do with abortion, that my hands were clean. And I remember when I first gave out my first abortion referral. And it was transforming for me because I know that many people who have the same mentality of, I personally wouldn't have an abortion. I personally don't agree with abortion, but it's none of my business to tell a woman what to choose. I know that we've come across so many people who have that mentality, and I was one of them. I was a Christian. I believed in God. I occasionally went to church, and I believed I was a good person. And I believed that I was doing a good service by helping prevent abortion. And because I personally wouldn't have an abortion, I personally didn't agree with abortion, I wasn't going to tell another woman what to do. It was her choice. It was between her and God. That was my mentality. So I had bought into all of Planned Parenthood's talking points. I bought into the propaganda. I bought into the euphemisms. I bought into all of the lies and the deceit. And I believed that my hands were clean. So when I had to give my very first abortion referral, I remember walking out of the room after speaking with this young college-age girl. And I went into my office and I began to cry. And I can't tell you exactly what it was that moved me to tears that day. I guess it was the sinking feeling that I thought I would never have to deal with abortion. That I personally was never going to have to be involved with abortion in any way. So that I could walk away unscathed, or maybe if I could just sleep better at night, right? If I had no involvement with abortion. And at that moment, I often tell people, I feel like I sold my soul, sometimes, that saying of selling your soul over to the enemy. That's how I felt. Because at that moment, I chose to refer for an abortion, support her right to choose for my job, for my position. It was more important for me to have my job and my position and that 3-day-a-week job and being comfortable than defending that life that was growing inside of her womb. And I knew better. I knew better because I myself was a teen mother. I had my daughter when I was 17. I was 16 when I became pregnant, and I ended up dropping out of high school. I was in an abusive relationship with her father. But I chose life for my daughter, and abortion had never crossed my mind. And so here I am several years later, more than a decade later, and I'm supporting a woman's right to kill her own baby. And yet I knew better. I knew that was a life. I knew from the moment that a pregnancy test says positive that there is this new, human, irreplaceable life. Irrepeatable, will never be repeated again. This human life growing within you. And as a mother, we're supposed to nurture and protect that innocent human life. I knew better. And day after day after day, it became easier for me to refer for those abortions. People would call and they would ask, do you do abortions here? And I would say no, but we do them at our affiliate in Dallas. Let me get you that information. And I didn't recognize myself anymore. For 3 years, I was a director of this facility, and I often look back and I wonder how many lives were lost, how many families destroyed, how many women are broken and torn apart. What are the consequences and the repercussions? What has unfolded in those lives of the people who I didn't intervene for to support their right to choose, their right to end the life of their own child? That's not what we're called to. And we know that. You know that, or you wouldn't be here. We're called to defend the defenseless. We're called to be a voice for the voiceless. And yet, day in and day out, by referring for abortion, by supporting a woman's right to choose, by defending safe and legal abortions, I was helping in life. I had blood on my hands, whether I wanted to see that or not. And so when people say, well, Ramona, you didn't work at an abortion facility, it doesn't matter. I was complicit. I helped women obtain that abortion. I didn't intervene and say, what about your baby? Let's choose another way. And any of you who do any type of sidewalk counseling, who work at pregnancy centers, who have volunteered, you know what your role is when a woman comes in and she's afraid and she doesn't know if she can choose life for her child, right? You know what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to fight for that life. not just for the life of that baby, but you're supposed to fight for the soul of that mother who you know is going to hurt after that abortion. That's what we are called to do as Christian people, is love our neighbor as ourselves. And if we're going to love our neighbor as ourselves, why would we allow them to hurt? Why would I allow a woman to hurt, to kill her baby, to end the life of her baby, and then she herself is going to live a lifetime of regret and pain? If I loved her, why would I want her to live that way? So I didn't love. And obviously I wasn't the good Christian lady that I thought I was, because I was thinking about myself. I was thinking about my own life, and I was thinking about what was good for Ramona, my part-time job, my comfort, my title, my opportunity. Me. I never thought of anyone else. And so even as pro-lifers, we struggle in this movement because we're accused of not caring. We're accused of only caring about the unborn, and we don't care about them once they're born, and that's a lie, and we know that. We are people of not just life, but of love. Great, great, selfless love. And that's what I learned through all of these years of being a person who speaks and advocates for life. And after God transformed my heart, I understood how wrong and how selfish I was. And not just being complicit in the deaths of all these babies, and having to reconcile that, and how difficult it was to reconcile that with God, and the great remorse that I felt when I thought about how many lives were broken and how many lives were lost just because of my silence. So oftentimes we, aside from the abortion, we know there are other issues when talking about Planned Parenthood. Specifically, and for me in particular, I want to talk on this point because it has to do with part of my conversion. When we talk about the problems of abortion, we oftentimes see the connection with sex trafficking, human trafficking. And we have to recognize that Planned Parenthood is also a great contributor when dealing with this issue as well. When I worked for Planned Parenthood, one of the things that troubled me most was to see the amount of young people who came into the clinic. And I know we have young ears here today, so I'll keep this as PG as possible. Young girls as young as 12 years old, 12, 13, 14, 15, children who were living a promiscuous lifestyle, who were given birth control and sent right back out the door. The greatest danger and the greatest threat to our family, aside from the abortion, when talking about Planned Parenthood, is how they intentionally drive a wedge between our children and their parents. And as a mother working for Planned Parenthood, I often had to try to reconcile that as well. My daughter and stepdaughter at the time were 14 and 12 years old. And so oftentimes I saw my own children in the faces of the young girls that would come into Planned Parenthood. And on one hand, we thought we were helping them, that they were being responsible by coming into Planned Parenthood and taking control of their reproductive health. How do you do that at 13? That they were being responsible by getting on birth control. And every day I would think to myself, how can I be okay with this? I would never want this for my own daughters. I would never promote that for my daughters. Oh yeah, okay, you want to be active. Let's go get you on birth control. I would never do that. Because I know what the consequences are. And it's not just physical. It's not just emotional. It's not just psychological. It's spiritual too. But here we were promoting promiscuity by saying, here's a green light, here's some birth control, go right back out and do whatever it is that you're doing. But at the same time, not knowing who they're doing that with. So when I talk about abuse or sex trafficking, Planned Parenthood doesn't care about that. And I'll give you a perfect example of a story that still haunts me all these years later. I remember a 15-year-old girl who came into the clinic with her father. I have no idea if this man was truly her father. I remember the phone call that I received a couple of days before her appointment, and it was her father who called and asked a lot of questions about whether or not he could take his daughter into the clinic. And he had talked about how his daughter had contracted herpes. And he and the mother were divorced. And he didn't want the mother to know. And if that was okay, if we could protect that privacy, if he brought his daughter in. And yeah, of course, absolutely. I understand, sir. You can imagine how my thinking was different working for Planned Parenthood at the time. Bring her in, we'll take care of her, we'll give her medication, we'll test her, we'll treat her, put her on birth control, blah, 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 blah. So he brings his little girl in, and she was in so much pain she couldn't sit down. She couldn't sit down in the lobby, she had to stand up. And what really bothers me all these years later as I look back and I wonder, was that really her father? Was it really her father? And even if it was her father, could she have potentially contracted it from him? Because we weren't asking the questions. What we saw were dollar signs because we had quotas to meet. Just like you hear stories from the abortion workers who say they had quotas for abortions, we also had quotas. We had a budget that we had to meet every month. And when you have those budgets in place and you're being pushed to meet them and exceed them, it no longer becomes about health care. You become a salesperson. And what you have to realize is that what Planned Parenthood non-abortion facilities, just like the one you have here in Elkhart, what they're doing is they're grooming future abortion clients. Because you don't end up at the abortion facility unless you're pregnant. And you don't become pregnant unless you're partaking in activities that would result in pregnancy. And they need to continue producing future clients. And how do they do that? They start with our children. And then they want to say that we as a parent cannot have a voice in our own child's health care. Because your child, 14, 13, 15, can walk into any Planned Parenthood without parental consent and get on birth control. And because of the HIPAA laws, you'll never know, and they can't release that information to you. So I watched day in and day out how Planned Parenthood drove a wedge between young children and their parents. And they need that in order to continue to drive future clients. So, where does the conversion take place? And how does this all fit in? In 2010, right around Christmas, I was troubled by a lot of things. I mean, you can imagine, working for Planned Parenthood, for me in particular, there were good things and there were bad things. The good things were few and far between. I didn't always feel like I was doing good things. The bad things were enough to keep me up at night. Couldn't sleep. I was always dreading, sometimes going into work. And I couldn't figure out, I could never pinpoint why I was having this internal battle, this internal struggle. It was the lack of being able to feel like you were protecting these young people. It was promoting, promiscuity instead of abstinence. It was questionable and unethical medical, practices, or the way that we charged for certain things. It was a culmination of things that bothered me. And so one evening, I'm kind of annoyed with my job, and I go Christmas shopping. And I'm driving around the parking lot at Walmart looking for a parking spot when I'm flipping through the radio channels. And I always tell people, it's a Holy Spirit moment when you flip over to the AM, because who searches for anything on the AM station? So I flip over to the AM station, and lo and behold, I land on our local Catholic Christian radio station in Dallas. And at that very moment, and again, it's the Holy Spirit, God is working. At that very instant that I turn on the radio, they're talking about abortion. And they're talking about Planned Parenthood. And I found a parking spot, and I was glued to the radio for an hour in the parking lot. That's Texas, and it's Christmas time, so it was warm. And I'm sitting there, and I'm flabbergasted and taken aback by one of the details, which seemed very odd. To you it may not, but at the time for me it was odd, hearing so many callers, women who were Christian, who had had an abortion. For me, I thought that I didn't know Christian women had abortions, right? And listening to these women and their stories, and talking about how Planned Parenthood treated them like cattle when they went in for their abortion. It was come in, come out, no counseling, when many times these women just wanted someone to convince them to keep their baby. And it reminded me of my clinic. Even though we didn't perform abortions, we still wanted to move women in and out like cattle, because it was about money. It wasn't about time. It wasn't about education. It wasn't about promoting abstinence. It wasn't about, looking for alternatives for anything. It was about get your birth control, get your STE testing, get your tests, get your treatment, let's go, move it out, right? So there was so many things that I had heard on that radio station that night that triggered me, made me wonder, what am I doing here? What is this all about? Who is Planned Parenthood? Who are they really? Now, Sherman Clinic had a constant prayer presence for the 3 years that I was there. And I called them the crazies, the crazy protesters that had nothing better to do with their lives but to be out in front of our facility. Don't they know we don't do abortions here? They need to go find a job. Go adopt some kids, right? How many times do we hear that from the abortion workers? And we had that constant prayer presence outside. And I know now, looking back, I know what was in the heart of those people, and I'm so grateful for them. They planted so many seeds in that time that I was there. But whenever I had heard this radio station, I'd gone home, I started thinking, I came back to work, saw the protesters, and I looked at them differently for the first time. I looked at them differently. It was just something about listening to that station and listening to the callers and the people talking about their witness out in front of these facilities that it changed me a little. I was a little softer that next day. So as time went on, I continued to listen to this radio station on my drive in and back home from work. And I would learn new things every day, more and more nuances about the pro-life movement and more information about the sanctity of human life. And it was, I could tell that there was this internal, tug of war happening. And then a month later, Lila Rose and Live Action released their sex trafficking expose. And in that expose, I don't know how many of you, show of hands, any of you ever seen the footage from that undercover sex trafficking? Okay, so Lila Rose and her organization Live Action, they had gone undercover in several Planned Parenthoods across the country. And they posed as sex traffickers who were bringing in underage girls for abortions and for testing and for services. And in all of these facilities, all of the employees were willing to aid and abet and cover up for these young women and these fake sex traffickers. When that expose came out, at the time, Cecile Richards, who was the president of Planned Parenthood Federation of America, went out publicly to do, a public repair and try to do damage control to the public, and say, that these videos are edited and they're fake and so on and so forth. But we're going to retrain all of our staff across the country on how to report sexual abuse, right? And at the time, I was one of the staffers. I was working still at Planned Parenthood at that time. And so one day we go into our meeting, our training, and it's this dark room, and we've got other employees from different facilities in there, and they pull down the projector screen. And they start playing all of this video footage that Live Action had obtained in years past, and that particular footage from the sex trafficking, and they played some audio footage, and I don't know if you're familiar too with some of the audio where they've caught employees willing to designate and allocate certain funds for just specifically minority babies to be killed in abortion. And as they're playing these videos, I'm sitting there kind of perplexed, like, what? Okay, I get it. I guess they're showing us what not to do. But we never got to the point about what to do in situations where we suspect sexual abuse or sex trafficking. And so at one point I just kind of got frustrated and I said, okay, hold on. Excuse me, but when are we going to talk about what we should do? As a clinic director, I want to know what policies and procedures to put in place so I'll know what to do in the event that something happens, or in the event that I suspect someone is coming into the clinic, and or if there's any type of sexual abuse. I want to know exactly what policies and procedures that I need to put in place to bring back to the staff so that I know that we're protecting our young women and girls and women. And she immediately said to me, Ramona, we're not here for that today. We're just here to talk about these undercover videos and to train you on how to identify, or if you suspect that someone's coming in to videotape you or record you. And at that moment, I realized that everything up to that point that I'd heard negative about Planned Parenthood was true. That they didn't care about women. They didn't care about young girls could potentially be abuse victims, just like that 15-year-old girl that came in with her maybe dad. That they only cared about one thing and one thing only, and that was money. And I walked out of that meeting and I realized that I had to get out of there. I know people often say, well, Ramona, you mean the abortion wasn't enough for you? Yeah, of course. But I, at that time, didn't understand my role. I didn't realize or come to that realization that I was complicit in abortion at that time. So it was these undercover videos from Live Action that prompted this sense of, oh my gosh, I gotta get out of here, right? Shortly after that, a little group shows up outside of my clinic. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're called 40 Days for Life. Yeah, nobody knows who they are, right? 40 Days for Life shows up outside of Planned Parenthood in Sherman, right? And this is a little town, about maybe 20,000 people, small city, doesn't do abortions. And this group of people come out for 40 days and pray. They'd never been out there before. They took a leap of faith and decided for the first time that they would come out and pray at a non-abortion facility. Prior to that, no one had ever prayed at a non-abortion facility. And when they took that leap of faith and came out and started praying, I took notice. And on the third day of that vigil, I walked out and I introduced myself to one of the prayer volunteers. And I said, my name is Ramona Trevino, and I'm the clinic manager here. And she gasped because I guess she thought something bad was going to happen next. And I said, I just want you to know that I don't want to be here anymore. And I really, really, really want you to pray for me. And it still amazes me after all these years to look back and think about how great God is. Because this woman that I spoke to, who prayed for me right then on the spot, wasn't even a prayer volunteer for 40 days. She had never ever prayed in front of any facility in her life. And she said that, and I found this out later, that God had placed it on her heart to go out and pray that day. And if she hadn't been there, no one would have been there when I walked out my clinic that day, because the one who was supposed to hold that hour vigil was running late at work. He was tied up. And so when I had the courage to go out, because, you know, kind of how you see in the movies, there's two different scenes going on, right? Like there's one going on with this lady who shows up to pray at Planned Parenthood, and then on the other scene, here's Ramona in the office going, go out, just have courage, go out, ask for prayers. When they show up, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to ask them to pray. When they show up, I'm going to go out there and ask them to pray. So I'm talking myself up. So you can imagine if I had walked out there, no one would have been there. And yet God placed this angel to be there that day, because I was meant to walk in. I'm now running out of time, so let me wrap this up. After that 40 Days for Life vigil, it ended, and I was still at Planned Parenthood. And I had hoped and prayed that at some point in those 40 days, something miraculous, more miraculous would happen, and I would have found another job, or something would have happened to where I could have left. I was struggling to leave my position. I wanted to leave Planned Parenthood, but I was worried about those things that we all worry about as adults. How are we going to make ends meet? What are we going to do without my income? How are we going to pay the mortgage? Is it going to be enough? We have mouths to feed. We have food to put on the table. My husband's income wasn't going to be enough. And I'm sitting down and I'm putting pen to paper and saying, I can't quit my job. I can't quit unless I have another one, in place. But obviously God has other plans, right? So after the 40 Days for Life vigil ended, I was driving home from work and I was feeling very down. And I remember crying out to God, thinking, God, why haven't you helped me? Why aren't you helping me? Why don't I have another job? You see that I want to leave. You see that I want to quit. I've had a change of heart. I understand Planned Parenthood's bad. And so I'm having this conversation with God, and now I probably think God was just kind of chuckling at me, like, oh, if you only knew, But I drove home in silence that day, which was weird because usually I'm always listening to the radio. And I parked into my driveway, and I had my head down, and I just thought, what am I going to do? I need to leave. How am I going to do this? How am I going to quit? And when I turned on the radio at that moment, again, I was tuning into the Christian radio, and the host was talking to this elderly gentleman. At that exact moment, they were talking about his public witness out on the sidewalk in front of abortion facilities and how he had been out there for almost 40 years. At that point, it was almost 40 years. And she said to him the words that would ultimately transform my life. She said, "Thank you, good sir, for your witness. Thank you for all that you do for our unborn." She said, because at the end of our lives, we're all going to have to stand before our Maker. And he's going to ask us, did you know? Did you know about abortion? And at that moment, I was no longer sitting in my car. Suddenly, I saw myself standing before God. And as she's saying these words to this man, I felt as though God was speaking them directly to me, saying, Ramona, did you know about abortion? And I began to weep. And I said, yes, yes. And she's speaking to the man, and she said, God is going to say, did you know that babies were being ripped from their mother's wombs, limb by limb, at the rate of over 3,000 a day? And I began to weep even more. And he's going to say to you, what did you do? And when she came to those final words, what did you do? I was crushed. And I began to plead and ask God for his forgiveness. It was at that moment that suddenly all the blood of those innocent babies were now on my hands. Because of my silence, because of my cowardice, because of my selfishness, and because I lacked the ability to love someone else as myself. And I remember just grasping the steering wheel so tight. That ugly crying. You know what I'm talking about? And begging God to forgive me. And I know that if it hadn't been for that moment, I would have never had the courage to just walk out of my job. On May the 6th of 2011, I walked into Planned Parenthood and I left my letter of resignation and I left the keys on the counter and I walked out. But because God is so great, he left me with this beautiful parting gift. On my last days there, a young girl had come in for a pregnancy test and I was alone. And so I took her back to do her pregnancy test and I gave her her results and she wanted an abortion. And because of this conversion that had just happened in my heart, I knew I couldn't promote it, I couldn't support it, I couldn't refer her. And I remembered sharing with her my own testimony as a teen mother and my own experience of being in an abusive relationship, and that's what we had in common. And as only God can write it, she ended up choosing life that day, right before I walked out of Planned Parenthood. And so when I left Planned Parenthood, as was said in my intro, that clinic permanently closed down 3 months later. And I continue to share my testimony, and one of the greatest things about my story is God's mercy and how great and merciful our Lord Jesus Christ is, and how as we march today and walk today, and the people and the hundreds of thousands of people that continue to march and walk and pray and fight and demonstrate and who continue to be a public witness in this fight. I don't ever want any of you forget that it's not about us, that every save, every victory belongs to Jesus. So God bless you in all you continue to do, and thank you so very much for having me and for allowing me to bend your ear for a little bit. God bless you.